Elden Ring Shadows of the Erdtree is too hard and gamers are too stupid and stubborn for video games. There's your hook, you filthy animals, and it's one that's only half wrong. Which half do I agree with? I guess we'll find out, but anyone who knows me can probably guess. It's the second half. I do not think that Shadows of the Erdtree is too hard, but I am fascinated by the claim that it is too hard, where this claim comes from, and what it reveals about game design tendencies, player expectations, and how games are constantly fighting against the worst tendencies of players. This video is only made possible by the Patreon supporters and YouTube members you see on the screen right now. If you would like to support the channel and get certain benefits like early access to video scripts, please consider supporting for as little as $1 a month. The link is in the description. The idea that Shadows of the Erdtree is too hard has quickly spiraled into one of 2024 gaming's defining subjects. Difficulty discourse dominates gaming discussions every year a new Soulsborne game comes out, but the discussion surrounding Shadows of the Erdtree is different. Unlike the endless tennis volley of Souls needs an easy mode into artistic vision and back and forth, the discussion has landed on the more blanket question of, is Shadows of the Erdtree too hard as a matter of game design? The source was also different. Instead of op-eds and Forbes calling Sekiro disrespectful for not including an easy mode, the Shadows of the Erdtree complaints are coming from Steam user reviews, Twitter posters, YouTube commenters, and even YouTubers.
And of course I could beat it, but I just don't really want to. I don't want to sit through 100 attempts or 50 attempts on every boss.
But me using split aggro or an overpowered build to ignore the mechanics doesn't make me like learning the boss mechanics.
Fucking reason for any game ever to be this hard. Everybody's like, well, Dark Souls 2 was this hard, and if you fucking enjoy this, you're a fucking asshole.
One of the early Shadows of the Erdtree mods is a journalist mode, quote-unquote, that decreases damage taken by 50%. A great name considering where the majority of complaints about the game's difficulty has come from, and where they decisively have not come from. In fact, many of the mods simply make the game easier. This hard deviation from past difficulty discourse made me curious because for a long time, the From Software games formed a strange alliance between critics and gamers. Demon's Souls won GameSpot's Game of the Year in 2009, Sekiro won the Games Awards Game of the Year in 2019, Elden Ring won the same award in 2022, Tim Rogers picked Dark Souls as his Game of the Decade, and Dark Souls was selected as the ultimate game of all time at the 2021 Golden Joystick Awards. Despite this critical lavishness, gamers who have long been hostile to all manner of game journalists, critics, reporters, and columnists adopted the Souls games as their own different cultural touchstone. Souls has always been popular, but until Elden Ring, it was less popular than it was notable. There was a ton of radical design in Demon's Souls and Dark Souls, some of which is still striking even after From Software developed an accidental hegemony. One of the most important decisions made by these two games, and the one that's of paramount importance for this video, is that Souls' early notoriety was because it stripped away almost all the yellow paint common in 7th generation AAA gaming. Yellow paint, as the proper noun I'll be using it as in this video, in the title and in the thumbnail, refers literally to the yellow paint slathered over interactable objects in games, like this breakable plank in Resident Evil Village, or this scalable cliff face in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Metaphorically, and more broadly, it refers to the non-diegetic elements in video games that tell players what to do. Think of Professor E. Gadd explaining Luigi's controls to Luigi in Luigi's Mansion, the objective marker in Pokemon Sun and Moon, or all of Navi's advice in The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. Souls has almost none of either type, and this was one of the key ways it differentiated itself from gaming orthodoxy. In the Honest Game Trailers video about Dark Souls, a portion of the series' infamous difficulty was attributed to its perceived lack of yellow paint.
When you're sick of having your hand held by today's AAA titles, take on the AAA version of Cat Mario. With hardcore features like no recharging health bars, no minimap, no explanation for how most of the game works,
Yellow paint has become a contentious topic in recent years, primarily because of its literal manifestation as bright house paint splashed over important interactable objects of both collectible and progression natures. This topic reached its apex in 2023 after the release of Resident Evil 4 Remake, saw a brief revival with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and is seemingly old news. However, under this broader definition of yellow paint is a scaffold to an overwhelming volume of video game discussion, particularly because of what it represents. Yellow paint primarily represents the multitude of explicit ways that a game attempts to get players to play it properly, which generates significant friction with many would-be and forlorn players. An incredibly invasive and pernicious idea in modern game criticism, both professionally and casually, is that games should allow players to tailor their own experience, to transform games into what they, the players, want out of them. In short, I think this idea sucks. In long, I think this idea sucks. It's an idea that posits that a game should bend around the expectations of a player instead of a player engaging with the rules of a game. After a decade and a half of watching YouTube game reviews where disembodied voices articulate observable flaws in games, often over footage of them refusing to learn from their own mistakes or learn a game's rules, it's been subconsciously absorbed into the zeitgeist to approach games and thinking about games in this way, to perform cunning is-ought fellatio on every game. Take, for example, Joseph Anderson's review of Dark Souls. I love Joseph Anderson and his videos, but he makes one point in this video specifically that has rung around in my head for years as being emblematic of this.
Ornstein and Smo show that some ways of playing Dark Souls are just flat out better, flat out easier. My first character was a knight with a longsword and a shield. My first kill of Ornstein and Smo took a long time, and I'm not talking about attempts, I'm talking about the actual duration of the fight when I killed them. Contrast this with summoning Solaire, who isn't even another player, and you have a tank who keeps Smo busy and you can just circle around Ornstein and safely destroy him.
The problem is that Joseph Anderson picks a way he wants to play, as a straight sword rolling machine, and is frustrated when the game isn't built exclusively around that, and also decries the other combat options in the game as being antithetical to the design philosophy that he wants Dark Souls to have. This isn't to say that any critique that Joseph Anderson makes against Dark Souls is without merit. Again, I think his videos are often incredibly insightful, but it's arguments that stem from this line of reasoning that can be particularly frustrating. For Joseph Anderson and many others on YouTube, Dark Souls combat and bosses are supposed to be built around basic melee builds, so much so that many reviews of the games or the bosses begin by noting that they played with these builds to maximize objectivity. For others, especially on the other side of the easy mode debate that has surrounded these games for years, these games should be walking simulators through beautiful art and world design should the player want that. Both of these arguments rely on ought statements, prescribing what the game should be, rather than observing what it is and going from there. This wraps us back around to yellow paint and how it gets players to play with the game instead of against the game. Some forms of yellow paint, such as the Luigi's Mansion example, are necessary bookkeeping to make a video game work. The combination of games being able to store more data and games moving away from instruction manuals produces a reality where, yeah, sometimes a character or disembodied pop-up needs to explain a game's controls. However, tutorial pop-ups or weird fourth wall breaking dialogue to quickly tell the player to use the R button to suck off the ghosts isn't viewed as a problem in the aggregate, but other forms of, we'll call it, more forceful yellow paint are more contentious, in part because they fight back against the friction caused by a player's tendency to try to tailor an experience instead of engage with an experience. These forms of yellow paint often manifest as pop-ups, both tutorials and button prompts, or as pieces of diegetic or non-diegetic graphic design to draw the player's eyes. Hyper-realistic graphics have gotten so obscenely, so thirst-inducingly good that the yellow paint needed to get specific responses from the player has become more obviously dissonant. In Resident Evil 4, breakable objects were easy to see. They literally had different brightness and resolution from the objects around them. In Resident Evil 4, again, those same boxes now have OSHA-approved yellow tape all over them to quickly signal that they are breakable against the sea of non-interactable, high-fidelity assets. The same for the ladders in the game, and it's these ladders specifically that made yellow paint a part of gaming vernacular. These ladders, dripping wet with a fresh coat of paint, have been called both immersion breaking and insulting. The argument goes that not only do the yellow ladders violate the diegetic realities of rural Spain, they signal an unspoken contempt against the idiot brains of idiot players, proclaiming that players cannot be trusted to understand the concept of ladders and their gravity-defying properties. Why, though? Why do the ladders get specifically cited for breaking immersion and insulting intelligence? In the original Resident Evil 4, item drops had big bright auras around them, and interactable objects like doors, lockers, and even ladders had big button prompts thrown on the screen. Just a giant handful of yellow paint savagely smeared across the screen. "Hey idiot," the game shouts at you, the player. "You can open lockers, numbnuts." Now, that argument is never made. Resident Evil 4 is considered one of the greatest games ever made. The greatest ever by myself, and part of that was a product of the era. This was a time of increasingly specialized animations. In Resident Evil, you had buttons to walk, rotate, aim, shoot, run, and interact, and all the actions in the game fell under these umbrellas. Importantly, the generic verb of interact referred to opening doors, picking up items, and menuing. Interact in Resident Evil 4 can refer to those actions, but also to jumping through windows, kicking down ladders, alongside executing melee attacks with basic environmental interactions. Modern Leon, unlike Leon Classic, has tons of context-specific animations bound to that big, shiny button on the screen. For players, the tight-knit set of actions like open door and pick up item being tied to a single button is intuitive, but pick up item and roundhouse kick isn't as intuitive a pairing. The yellow paint in this instance helps relieve cognitive overload on the player, while maintaining a kinetic pace of combat and the easy pace of looting, while also providing a massive, intrusive reminder that the way you should be playing Resident Evil 4 is by strategically maneuvering around the environment through windows and doors and ladders, while offering those big AoE melee options as rewards for getting headshots and knee shots instead of aiming about wildly, and that you should be constantly looting items both from enemies and the environment. Resident Evil 4 is a game about taking your time in a hurry, and the yellow paint is there to get players to do just that. Resident Evil 4 Remake, coming out in 2023, 14 years after Demon's Souls sent shockwaves around the gaming world, made a ton of effort to reduce the obvious, non-diegetic yellow paint that was all over the original. The aura around loot is shrunk into a thin, short pillar of translucent light. Button prompts have been reduced to small icons above interactable objects that move with the camera, and the yellow paint covering all the boxes and barrels and ladders is importantly diegetic, unlike the resolution difference between the interactable and non-interactable objects of the original Resident Evil 4. You know what I've never done on this YouTube channel? I've never done one of those fun, childish window movie maker transitions. Let's do one. As a treat. Okay, so arguably the most important innovation of Demon's Souls and Dark Souls amidst a sea of arguably most important innovations is that the game makes a lot of its yellow paint diegetic. Instead of pop-ups, tutorial messages both appear and are interacted with the same as the multiplayer player messages that litter the world. Dark Souls is a game notorious as a difficult-to-traverse Metroidvania, but the general direction of the adventure is given by the Crestfallen Warrior at the beginning of the game, and King Seeker Framped in the mid-game instead of objective markers or a waypoint. The weapon upgrade system is seen as obtuse, but is explained by Andre the Blacksmith if you ask him. At the time, critics praised the diegetic yellow paint for its boldness, but there still is non-diegetic stuff in the game. Doors, kickable ladders, levers, bonfires, and item pickups all have button prompts, and item drops have these now iconic ethereal auras. Demon's Souls also has this one developer message in the Fool's Idol boss room that hints at how to crack the boss's puzzle. This is remarkably similar to Resident Evil 4, with a key divergence. Dark Souls has no objective marker. It has objectives, but unlike Resident Evil 4, which dutifully marks objectives on its linear map like the loyal lover it is, Dark Souls offers no escape from its world outside of those small button prompts around interactable objects. Growing up in the shadow of Dark Souls, Resident Evil 4 Remake seeks to minimize its non-diegetic yellow paint as much as possible. Resident Evil 4 Remake shrinks button prompts, it shrinks item markers, it does have objective markers on its map, but unlike Final Fantasy VII Remake, a game that has non-diegetic blue arrows hovering by its ladders, Resident Evil 4 opts for the diegetic variety of yellow paint. This diegetic, this literal yellow paint, presents a weird conundrum. Like Andre explaining weapon upgrades, it's diegetic, it's of the game's world, unlike the sleek, modern, but distant blue arrows of Final Fantasy VII Remake ladders. So why do people get mad about these ladders specifically? People argue that it's both because it breaks immersion and because it insults the player's intelligence. These are both true claims, I think, but also to a certain extent justified on the developer end. The yellow paint being thrown up as diegetic vomit becomes an almost anti-diegetic element. It serves the same purpose as the Dark Souls button prompts or the big button in the original Resident Evil 4 or the blue arrows in Final Fantasy VII Remake, and as a person that has probably spent 10,000 lifetime hours playing video games, I instantly recognize that this is a visual element for me specifically. As a piece of information on a heads-up display like HP or stamina, it wouldn't register as anything except a helpful bit of guidance, but as a diegetic element, it's dissonant. It strictly exists for the same reason the HUD exists, but with no place in the world itself. It is worth considering that most diegetic elements in most narrative art exist for the audience's sake. The basic building blocks of visual language are full of unrealistic tricks to draw the viewer's eye and to create the different moods and tones, clarity or confusion or whatever may be the desired outcome. However, unlike basic compositional principles like the rule of thirds and leading lines, the yellow paint ladders exist outside of the logic of the game's world and compositions. In Elden Ring, From Software uses the non-diegetic guidance of grace on the map to point the player in the general direction of the main path, but also uses diegetic composition in the world structure, such as the massive golden Erdtree above, the bending roads, and frequent high vantage points to help guide the player towards interesting landmarks without the use of yellow paint, including the leading lines of the pillars in Mogwin's palace that point straight to the boss room. Capcom wanted to avoid as many unnecessary non-diegetic HUD elements as possible, but ran into the unfortunate problem that many people who play games, not just casuals or the newbies, but many capital G gamers are unrelentingly stubborn boneheads. This sounds mean, and I do mean it to be just a little bit mean, but as the great yellow paint discourse of 2023 raised the internet, horror stories began to emerge from many game developers sharing their experiences with playtesting. Alex Rushdie, the head of small indie studio 13am Games, claimed that when demoing their games, they frequently had to teach players how to hold controllers correctly, and for a developer like Capcom who needed to sell a ton of copies of Resident Evil 4 and keep player retention high for the Resident Evil series, this is kind of a nightmare. Damian Schubert, the creative director of Boss Fight, wrote on Twitter about how during focus tests, they would watch players take 45 minutes to open a single door. So for many developers, yellow paint and its many incarnations is a way to prevent players from getting stuck on trivial objects and getting frustrated. With regards to what must have been the frustrating playtest that led Capcom to paint the ladders yellow, part of the rationale for conceding part of the art and world design to yellow paint is because it's a ladder and this is Resident Evil 4. If players spend more time running around stuck, not even attempting to use the ladder, that mysterious ladder that leads in the general upward direction Leon needs to go, than they do fighting El Gigante, is that Resident Evil 4? It was, given the incredible realism and darkness of the graphics, the correct decision to provide guidance. The mistake was making it literal yellow paint instead of metaphorical Final Fantasy VII Remake yellow paint. Even with the graphical concerns, it's fascinating that ladders, sometimes the only object in an environment, just get ignored by so many players. It's as if players frequently expect progress to just be handed to them simply for having the game open and the controller in their hands. In this way, yellow paint is important for getting players to properly engage with a game's mechanics and rules. A long time ago, H-Bomber Guy caught heat for saying that it was possible for players to play a game wrong in his Bloodborne video. Even though I disagree with his specific example regarding shields and Dark Souls, he was absolutely correct as a matter of game design principle. Games are games, and that means there are rules and regulations around player behavior. With how commonplace it is for arguments and debates around games and game design to focus on players and what players want to do, many contentious topics from difficulty to side quests to open worlds and so on swirl around the massive drain of whether or not players should be allowed to pick and choose which parts of a game they engage with. For From Software games, the question is, if players want to experience the world design and atmosphere of the games, should there be a story mode or an easy mode that allows them to do that? While I'm not interested in answering that specific question because the answer is a flat, boring no, the general premise is a wilderness commanded by yellow paint. Much of the conversation around Shadow of the Erdtree's difficulty has run into the big, fat elephant of the game Shadow Tree fragments. And yes, it's pronounced Shadow Tree because it uses Old English spelling conventions like Everjail, or why Kate Sith is actually pronounced Ketchy because it's Gaelic. Anyways, the Shadow Tree fragments became an inflamed topic because they are an upgrade material for the player character themselves. At launch, each Shadow Tree level gave the player a 5% buff to offense and defense. It's not a lot, but it adds up quickly. Many players getting borked by early bosses like Raylana or Blackjail Knight questioned whether or not Shadow Tree fragments should even be a feature, or were shocked to find out what the fragments do. This is interesting because Shadow Tree fragments and its sister item, Revered Spirit Ashes, received one of the few pop-up messages in Elden Ring after the optional tutorial dungeon. The Soulsborne games frequently have items and goodies and secrets that help make areas and bosses easier. An example of this would be the Numbing Mist outside of the Vicar Amelia boss room in Bloodborne, an item that lets the player stop Amelia's healing, a move that extends the fight to the point of pushing players to go elsewhere. In fact, many facets of the Soulsborne games that are considered oppressively difficult can be overcome by reading the instruction manual that comes free with the complimentary flavor text of all items. While From Software is usually okay with players setting themselves up for failure by not listening to NPCs or reading what items do, the Shadow Tree fragments are clearly different. They are simply too good to let the player walk away from without a big helping of yellow paint. This isn't actually a new type of yellow paint for Souls. When the player arrives in Lordran for the first time, a message reads that the player can level up and kindle at bonfires. With no level up maiden to tell the player to level up, the game shows that players cannot be trusted to read the options at the bonfires. It would be fascinating to learn how many Dark Souls players didn't know they even could level up until looking up on the internet how to do it. Kindling, the other mechanic that's yellow painted in this message, is one that's frequently unused by players despite it being explained to the player by the NPC sitting right next to the bonfire next to the yellow paint message, who also tells the player to take the stairs instead of getting killed 20 times in the graveyard.
You'll have to climb the stairs up the ruins and access the undead burrow through the waterway.
With Shadows of the Erdtree, one argument against the Shadow Tree fragments is that they require a lot of exploration. Some are perhaps too hidden, and what if the player simply does not want to do all that? What if they want to go from boss to boss, clear each area in a couple of attempts, and be done with the game? It's an interesting argument because Elden Ring is an open-world game. The base game was incredibly open, with one of the first lessons taught to players by early game bosses like the Tree Sentinel and Margit being to leave and come back later when you're stronger. Some players don't like this kind of gameplay loop, and that's fine. Some players prefer the good old straight-up lock-in linear challenge like Castlevania or Contra or Ninja Gaiden. However, by no means does Elden Ring have to provide an option to taste like that kind of game, and neither does any other game have to have flavor options for every potential taste a player may have. Elden Ring is an open world game. Anyone buying the game would know that ahead of time, and the game uses its yellow paint, especially with the Shadow Tree fragment pop-ups and Shadows of the Erdtree, to push the player towards exploration instead of bullheadedness. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a game that got criticized a little bit for its yellow paint. It does look pretty silly on all these rock formations, but what's interesting is how this intersects with the game's least popular area. Gongaga is considered the worst area in the game by many players. For one, it's a forest region, and forest just doesn't have that same pizzazz as a lava mansion. but it's also the one region in the game that demands a lot of the thorough player trying to explore. Rebirth is an open world game in the Ubisoft mode. That is to say, it's set in a mostly horizontal world that's very spacious and generally tells players where every point of interest is with highly detailed quest markers and points of interest. In most non-Gongaga areas, you run to the Ubisoft towers, you collect the map markers, and you run to them. But in Gongaga, even the act of accessing the towers is a navigational puzzle. Gongaga is deeply concealed by its forest, and it's also the one area in the game that takes constant advantage of verticality, not just because some areas are higher than others, but because the player needs to wrap around the vertical landscape and use the terrain to their advantage to find new places. You can see all the yellow paint littered on your map, but you have to read the environment itself to get to those points instead of mindlessly riding the chocobo from A to B. Frustration with Gongaga, the best region in the game to explore, is a testament to the resilience of Ubisoft's open world design. Developers want to avoid player frustration, and yellow paint is the ultimate lubricant for gamer brain, a way to hold the player's face to the intended design of a game. Even clumsy examples like the Resident Evil 4 ladders are there to guide players past the walls in their brain that will make them stubbornly do nothing, not use shadow tree fragments, and not check ladders even when they need to go up. This is why developers, even ones as lauded for their esoteric defiance as From Software, use yellow paint. At the most extreme, you have a game like Sekiro, which might be completely unplayable to anybody but the most hardcore if the yellow paint of these uniformly marked ledges and the perilous attack symbols were removed. Shadows of the Erdtree, on the other hand, would be perfectly fine without the pop-up for the Shadow Tree fragments, but they are so fundamentally important at making the game beatable for most players that a not-so-subtle pop-up to remind players that this is still Elden Ring is probably for the best. Go out and explore, find the new cookbooks, find the new weapons, find the new Spirit Ash summons, find the new level-ups. This is the fundamental core of what yellow paint is. Games, ultimately, need to drive the player to play the game, to play by the game's rules. Resident Evil 4 is a high-octane action horror game that needs you to pick up the pace, so throw some yellow paint on a ladder. We gotta get a move on. Elden Ring is a big, open-world adventure, so Shadows of the Erdtree, wanting players to explore and discover the world, ties the power's player to exploration. The debate around the Shadow Tree fragments is something that's bad because it forces players to play the game in a way they don't want to, is why yellow paint in all its forms is such a necessity. Video games, the medium, is for everyone. No individual video game is for everyone, and that's fine. The funniest outcome of every time yellow paint discourse rises up is that it invariably focuses on how it insults the player's intelligence, and it kind of does. All forms of yellow paint are there to safeguard against players choosing to not read their instruction manuals, players not wanting to explore an open world game, players who forget what ladders do, and in general, to safeguard against players making up their own rules to the game and getting frustrated when the game doesn't reward them for their made-up rule set. Gamers, and I mean this very kindly, are really bad at video games. Not in terms of skill, although that is also true. Earlier, I had said that gamers formed a rare symbiosis with critics over the Souls games. Much of the gamer attachment to From Software came from the fact that these games had been soft gate-kept by Namco Bandai's uber-cringe, lame-as-hell prepare-to-die marketing. So even though they were popular, a sizable enough portion of players stayed away, which allowed gamers to take From Software on as some sort of anti-casual totem to protect their gamer identity. Souls' pre-purchase filter, one that still exists in small pockets today if you look at the recent assault by gamers to mischaracterize the pause button discourse around Souls in an attempt to drive people away from the series, allowed people who culturally identify themselves with the playing of the video game to have something to prove their indomitable video game worth. Get good as a mantra was there as a filter, not as a mindset for how to play these adventure games. Elden Ring, being one of the highest-selling games of the decade, blew the door off of that, opening up a wave of gamers complaining about From Software both selling out and making games that are way too hard. Elden Ring's popularity created a near one-to-one match between From Software's popularity and notoriety. So, suddenly, gamers who have always been terrible at these games reversed course to argue against the difficulty of the games instead of rallying behind it as a casual filter. A non sequitur, sure, but here's a clip of Matthew Matosis complaining about how the From Software games have sold out to casuals over footage of him getting shellacked by prowling magus in congregation.
Players want convenience, so they can fast travel and respec their stats, removing absolutely any and all tension wherever possible, just like every other RPG from the past 10 years. At some point, you just start to wonder what's next on the chopping block. Maybe the next game will have a built-in function to back up your save files, so you don't have to think too hard about any of those pesky decisions.
The weird part about difficulty is that skill at video games is an entirely meaningless metric. Video games are just, in general, hard. You have to use the disembodied controller to send abstract messages to John Fantasy to make sure he punches Sephiroth with his sword, and the timing, muscle memory, and decision-making required of this is difficult in general as an activity. If anything, hardcore gamers tend to exhibit a lot more stubbornness towards games, using their baseline knowledge of video games to override the explicit instructions of a game. The truth is that Capcom isn't just concerned about the player who has never played a game, or the player who hasn't played a game since the original Resident Evil 4. They are just as concerned with the smug hardcore gamer who just kinda actually really sucks at games. Yellow paint in the form of lengthy tutorials and gaudy ladders and text pop-ups will continue to be the norm so long as players consistently refuse to engage with games. It is, as Bandai Namco has seen, enough of a struggle to get players to read a text pop-up. So often, the easiest and most elegant solution is to outright prevent players from getting in their own way by having a laborious tutorial like at the beginning of The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, or having yellow paint splattered all over the cliffs of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. The lesson to learn from yellow paint, I think, is to be much more active while playing a game. Recently, I was getting very frustrated with Like a Dragon Ishin. Coming off of Sekiro, my muscle memory wanted it to work the same, and while there are similarities, I began to enjoy Ishin much more when I started playing it as Ishin, instead of ignoring all of its yellow paint by trying to play it like Sekiro. The combat still does kind of suck, this is still a Like a Dragon game after all, but the frustration subsided, and I was able to enter a much better flow state with the game by observing it, and actively learning from my mistakes, and paying attention to animations and button timings and delays, and everything just felt better. In a way, what I had to do was make my own yellow paint, and make my own brain a machine for learning a game, instead of a filter to only absorb the lessons I wanted to learn to try to make it into another Sekiro. In general, this refusal to learn and grow within a game is reflective of the macro problems gamers have with being bad at dealing with change. Remakes change too much, characters change over time, mechanical systems change over time, constant whinging over the woke agenda or whatever, and a general frustration that the path of least resistance isn't the solution to all problems in an individual game, or the medium as a whole, or the social context around a medium. In their own special little way, gamers are dumber in their approach to playing games than an octopus in an aquarium is when given a food maze. Yellow paint in its literal form is a response to changing technology, but the persistence and volume of yellow paint at large is as much a product of the way people play with and engage with games. The great mercy is that yellow paint has an incredibly minimal impact on the quality of games. It's mostly notable, perhaps, as a cultural artifact, a symbol of game designers having to fight back against the horrible tendencies of players to not play games, but to attempt to passively and gluttonously consume them for all their content bits. So much of the approach by so many is to view games as functional products, a heightened version of the blue curtains problem, where the art needs to work for me because I paid for it, a problem made more extreme by the cost of video games. They're expensive. If you want to play some video games, your ass needs to get a job. However, games are fundamentally art. They pour from the same capricious part of the soul that births all creativity, and not the impulse that tells some engineer to make a moderately useful, highly profitable washing machine. No amount of grumpy YouTube and Steam comments makes games products for the sucking off of the player. They are experiences that you immerse yourself into rather than experiences spoon-fed as comfortable, low-effort content consumption. The yellow paint is there to help you get to that point, and that's all there is to it. Nothing more and nothing less.